Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning and welcome to the 34th Annual Demographic Workshop, jointly conducted by SCAG and USC. But here we are in beautiful SCAG headquarters, and this is a new thing. Last 3 years we were virtual, online, and now we're in person with some overflow people online, like 500 of them, and 150 here are going to be here today in the room. So thank you all for coming early to get started. And we're going to have a great day here. My name is Dowell Myers. I'm a professor at USC. I'm going to be emceeing the event, and I get to participate even with my own paper presentation later this morning, which I'm happy about. I'm going to begin by introducing somebody who's very important to me and to my school, a person who is the Vice Dean for Research and is a rising star in our academy. And to give you welcome remarks, I want to introduce Alice Chen.
Thanks, Dowell. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alice Chen, the Vice Dean for Research at the University of Southern California Sol Price School of Public Policy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this fantastic conference focused on the seismic generational shift. This is the 34th year this annual conference has occurred. That's very long. Not many research activities can claim that long of a persistence in our university or probably anywhere in California. Our school is very pleased to be sponsoring and co-organizing this annual demographic workshop conference, but it would not be possible without our partners at SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, which is the largest regional agency in the nation. For over a dozen years now, we have been working on this project together, and it's been an excellent joint venture. Now, the history of this conference began at USC, and USC Professor Dowell Myers has been the principal organizer for the last 24 years. Throughout these years, Professor Myers, who is both a demographer and an urban planner, has carried the series forward through our school's population dynamics research group. In recent years, the highly skilled staff at SCAG has been indispensable in sustaining the high quality of this conference. Their outreach and platform have been instrumental, and we at USC would like to thank our partners at SCAG and for all of their work. I especially want to thank SCAG Executive Director Kome Ajise for supporting this endeavor, and for his principal organizer, Kevin Kane, who serves as the program manager for demographics and housing at SCAG. We also recognize our other terrific co-sponsors of this workshop, the U.S. Census Bureau, California State Census Data Center, the California Department of Finance, and the California Department of Housing and Community. Demographic data trends will be discussed in this conference are crucial for decision-making at the local, federal, government levels, for businesses, for nonprofit organizations, and for private citizens. In particular, this conference will tackle important questions related to, for example, housing dynamics. How have housing shortages contributed to the sharp downturn in residential mobility over the last 10 years? How has the gap in Hispanic and white home ownership changed over that time? And how has the recession affected that gap? It will also target questions related to demographic changes, of course. Together, we will discuss questions regarding changes in race captured in the 2020 census, drivers of the renewed U.S. fertility downturn, and the importance of children today in supporting an aging population and economy. Policymakers confront unprecedented demographic challenges, especially with the falling birth rates, the labor shortages, high housing prices, and the increasing economic polarization. In light of these demographic developments, it is even more important for us to consider how to build across generational and other divides. I know this conference will begin to provide some fruitful answers, and I look forward to the expert panels, the roundtable discussions, and our intriguing keynote by Jean Twenge, a professor of psychology at San Diego State University, whose book I think you guys all have. And she will be discussing how the 6 generations currently living in the US conflict, compete, and connect with one another. So once more, on behalf of USC Price, I'm delighted to welcome your participation and all of our many hundreds of online participants at this year's exciting conference. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Alice. Wow, so that's why she's the dean and I'm a professor. That's an excellent start. Now I want to bring up to the dais a person who needs no introduction in this room. He owns this room, the executive director of SCAG, Kome Ejise.
Thanks, Dowell, and I really appreciate the opening by Vice Dean Chen. I think she set the stage for what the day is going to be like. My job this morning is really quickly to welcome you to SCAG. And on behalf of President Art Brown and in the entire SCAG community, I want to just say thank you for all being here, and we welcome you to our 34th annual demographic workshop. I'm always pleased with the wide range of participation we get, and I think this year is uniquely different because we've sort of blown all of the records that we've had in terms of participation. I know there are hundreds of folks online, and we have registrations from outside of not only our region, but outside of the state. We are expecting to be engaging in meaningful conversations about what's changing in our demography and how that affects us, both from among those in the room here, and obviously you'll hear from others that are online as we live stream. It is a great privilege for us at SCAG to be able to bring together the best minds across the region and the state so that we can help jurisdictions meet their needs and work towards a better future for all the people, especially here in Southern California. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our partners in this event, specifically Professor Dowell Myers and the USC Price School. We've been together, we've been stewards of this demographic workshop for the last 34 years. Most things do not last 34 years. I hope you all know that. So this is a great venture. And it's just a really tremendous privilege to be here again today. I'd like to also thank the Census Bureau's Los Angeles Regional Office and the State of California's Department of Finance Demographic Research Unit for contributing so much to this event and annually in helping this region over the years. I'm sure that most of you already know SCAG and why demography matters to us. Well, if you do not know SCAG, I think Vice Dean Chen already mentioned that we are the largest metropolitan planning organization in the country. I am required to say that every time I speak, by the way. We are the largest MPO in the country, and we bring together stakeholders from across 6 counties and 191 cities to plan for Southern California's transportation, housing, and land use, and many more things that come across our way. Fundamentally, our focus is on the people of Southern California, not just how many there will be, but what their needs are, and where and how they live, and how they form, and how all of that forms the economy of the region. This year's program brings together the best and the brightest minds to inform the leaders and practitioners in Southern California on what we ought to be considering as we look into the future. We've always prided ourselves in trying to understand who we plan for as we lead regional planning efforts in Southern California. And because we're virtually streaming this event, today's discussion will be even more far-reaching. We have other regions in California involved, and so those tuning in from afar, I want to say welcome to all of you, and it's good to have you all here. I'd like to also thank all of our moderators and speakers and roundtable leaders for bringing their expertise and talents to this program today. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. We have more than 600 participants signed up for this event, both virtually and in person. And I'd encourage those who are sitting way back there that you might find it more comfortable sitting at the table, because not only do you have a place to take notes more comfortably, but you also have access to a mic and you can heckle if you need to of some of the speakers. No, you can ask questions directly into the mic. I want to take a moment to recognize one of my regional council members here, Honorable Margaret Clark from the city of Rosemead. Thanks for joining us, Margaret. And with that, I also want to note that we have not only do we have 600 folks participating, we also have many of them representing about 100 different organizations from across the region, across the state, and beyond. And so I look forward to the rest of the program today. And again, I want to say thank you. So.
Thank you, Kome. Thank you. 34 years, how do you do that? It's because we got such a dramatic platform. We live on this platform in Southern California. It's the greatest demographic laboratory in America, really. All the big events have happened here earlier than they happen elsewhere in the country. So it's been a great stage for us to perform research on. The problems are never ending. They're getting wilder all the time. And we have increasingly found access to better and better data, which allows us to do this annually, always with fresh information. Speaking of which, SCAG staff has been really busily working on some recent data. I'm going to have Kevin Kane describe what's up here. This is newly produced just this week, I guess, right, Kevin?
Yeah, thanks, Dowell. I just wanted to make a quick plug on here for the material that kind of accompanies the program now. We're fairly fortuitous in timing in that the demographic workshop is just after the annual release of New American Community Survey 1-year data. So over the last few days, the demographic workshop team has put together a report of kind of the quick hits, the top hits in terms of population and social trends, in the counties of the SCAG region and beyond. So I really encourage you to check it out here on this QR code that you see. Just posted about an hour ago or so. I'll leave you with a couple of highlights. The rate at which Southern Californians are leaving the state leveled off in 2022. Work from home, which tripled during the pandemic, ticked down from 19% to below 16% in the past year. And labor force participation in Southern California, even though we're older, increased almost a full percentage point. So again, encourage you to take a look.
Good stuff. All right, I haven't seen it myself. Breaking news here at the 34th annual. Thank you, Kevin. All right, so now we're going to start with our first panel for the day. We call it the demographic checkup because there's always new things to check up on every year. And so I'm going to have invite Beth Giraz and David Moctezuma and Walter Schwarm to come up to the dais here. And Beth is program director for U.S. programs at Population Reference Bureau. I'll have her introduce her panel. So Beth, take it away.
Thank you. So I'm checking, but I am not going to talk much. We have a lot of information that our panelists want to share with you at the demographic checkup this morning. And I want to make sure that they have time to do that because people are why we're here today. And as Kevin alluded to with the report that just came out, trends are changing. So I'm going to do the very briefest of introductions of our panelists, Walter Schwarm and David Moctezuma. Their bios are in the program. So both distinguished panelists, but I will let you read rather than take time away from them. And at the end of their two presentations, I'm going to help facilitate a conversation. And I know this has been a very quiet room this morning. I encourage you all to take notes as they're talking and ask questions. I can ask, but you'll have more fun if you're the ones who are asking questions. So without further ado, Walter.
Good morning, everybody. As we look forward here, I mean, obviously one of the things that is sort of on the agenda, there we go, is, I mean, in terms of a demographic checkup, we released an interim projection series, and that is an important point to make. This is an interim series. We don't really plan on having a new baseline, fully informed by the 2020 census and et cetera out until next year. So this is still got pieces from 2010 in there in terms of race ethnicity distributions, in terms of sort of the age structure of the population and the sex ratio. So there are, good chances that some of this will change as we continue to look forward and it goes. I suppose the thing that I'll point out is, this is my back to last year slide. I did a similar checkup last year, only this was more about sort of post-pandemic trends. And I had this as my last slide with this blue line about, hey, we really don't know where we're going. If I plug in some of the ideas that we see at this particular point in time, we are likely to see much lower population. But then I did point out that, this does not mean that we're focused on this or we're stuck on this forever, but that population momentum is a big deal and it takes some time to overcome. And so with that in mind, let's talk about this interim series and what it looks like. You'll notice there's a big change in that because when I was talking last year, or the year before last, we hadn't really seen the recent out-migration, the negative growth in California. You see that here very clearly. And you also see the fact that we have now adjusted the last couple of years of the 2010s, so 2018, 2019, to reflect relatively low growth in those years as well. That was revealed through the Census 2020. So this is a very different line. And admittedly, you might focus on the 2050 to 2060 part. That is, a good 40 years from now. That is probably the most part of the most sort of random part or the most element of the projection that has the most standard error. So, I know that's what everyone's been focusing on, but remember, that's the one that's most likely to change when we eventually move this to 2070. But what's behind this thing? We have this lower starting population. We are down almost 680,000 people since 2020. This affected the pandemic, an effect of out-migration, and most importantly, an effect of very little international in-migration or immigration to California. We do see domestic migration returning to a trend that existed during the 2010s. So, in terms of where we're going with this and what causes this general thing, I'll talk a lot about migration at the very end of this of today. But I can assure you, it's not really the domestic migration trends that are driving this. Foreign migration, we're at about 140K, and when it finally goes out, it's fewer births and higher deaths. And so let's look at the first two parts of natural increase as we go along here to begin with. Total fertility rate, as you can see here, when we're looking, there's some age-specific rates. Many of these are good. We really don't like teenage pregnancies. So the fact that the 15 to 19-year-olds end up with, virtually no births towards the end of the series, it's great. We really do want those individuals to complete their schooling and, really have time to really want a family and so forth. Rates that exist as they go along with 20. You can see we continue to have this idea that individuals don't really have children until their 20s. Until their early 30s. There's an upward limit to how far that's going to go after that. And fertility declines. You can see it's very rapid decline from 2008 down to about where we are now. Notice it doesn't move much more. So in other words, the fertility that we're projecting in the future really does level out, at least for California on the whole, around 1.5. And you really, we don't foresee us going too much lower than that. There is still strong desire for children. There's still, the ability to sort of find homes for them and find housing that's suitable to have children in within California for some individuals. So really, we aren't looking at Korea or maybe Italy where we're at, near 1 or below 1. Here are the, sort of the SCAG counties when it comes really down to it. Obviously, the coastal ones have a lower fertility rate, and that reflects both the age structure of the population that lives in the coastal areas, the affordability issues of living in the coastal areas, and, to a certain extent, some of the other demographic components of them. And then we look at sort of the Inland Empire. They have a little higher fertility, and that kind of follows this idea that as individuals are interested in having children, they sometimes move to more suburban areas because they're looking for the schools, they're looking for the opportunity to have, slightly different type of house or type of, sort of environment, and end up with a little bit higher fertility. Fertility is, kind of, I've talked about similar things several times. Predecessors of mine also talked about similar things. You can see that fertility has been declining for many years now. I think this is new here. This is the first time we've cast mortality since the pandemic. And we do see two things. Now, admittedly, I put in a picture there on the right side that, really you should be focusing on mostly the blue line there. The other lines are historical in that sense. It shows an increase in life expectancy across time. But I did highlight the two aspects that are really new in the data right now. The red circle, as you can see in my little thing there, that's COVID-19. That's the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic in the future, in the sense that we've got COVID-19 as an endemic disease now. What does that mean? It means it's like the flu. It comes around and we may have little pockets where it gets worse, it gets better again after that one. But really, as it is right now, and I don't see, I don't think anybody has really said that we're exterminating or rooting out the COVID-19, that it is an endemic disease. Which, what does that mean? It means about 100 to 125 more deaths every week compared to age-adjusted pre-pandemic death levels. And that's the red circle that you can see there. And it is, unfortunately, unfortunately, the deaths here are indeed of individuals that are, slightly older in the population. And that does have a significant drag on overall life expectancy in California. The other piece that's new and sort of really troubling to a certain extent, and you can see it both in women, but primarily in men, is these deaths of despair. This is the opioid epidemic, the sort of suicide and fentanyl issue. And, notice here we're moving from the lowest line is today, and the red line at the very top of those things, that's the end of the projection series. We don't assume that, these things are going to be as bad as they are today forever, but they are a significant drag on particularly the deaths of despair, because they occur so early in the lifespan of individuals. They're a significant drag on the life expectancy of individuals. So we end up with these life expectancy, sort of pieces between California and Los Angeles. And you can see, we do see recovery, right, from the pandemic. The life expectancy losses from the actual pandemic are significant, but we do see, we do see improvement as time goes on. It's just this improvement is not as great as it used to be, which is to really say that there are more deaths coming in the future. So if we talked about, sort of natural increase, so that's fertility and mortality here, we end up with this piece as the components of California. And, I've kind of put California all out here with births and deaths, and you can see births sort of remain more or less semi-constant towards the until we get to the very end of the projection series. And that's not because we've changed fertility. That's because to have future children, you need to have children now. And as we have lower fertility currently, 20, 30 years from now, when that smaller cohort of individuals that are being born right now go to have children, there are fewer of them, and you end up with the declining amount of births towards the very end of this projection period. And it's compounded on the other side by, the purple line here to a certain extent, which is the deaths that are which start increasing. And this is not increasing because we've cranked up mortality rates or anything else like this. This is purely the fact that the baby boomers are now reaching those years of maximum likelihood of death. And this particularly begins to happen probably around the late early 2040s and on from there. It's really that which drives this red line, which is ultimately pop change, positive all the way through. And then finally, as we get towards the 2040, 2045 range, yes, this projection series does indeed have negative population growth towards the very, very small amount, but towards the end of this series. And this is largely because natural increase becomes natural decrease. And we're lucky in some ways, I would point out with this, that last year, and this is somewhat pandemic related, but not really, because it is 2022 data, there were 23 states that had natural decrease already right now. So the fact that California isn't projected to see natural decrease for another 20, 22, 23 years is significant. It really says that we are still a very strong and a very vibrant state with, opportunities for individuals. So a national projection is going to come out, in about 3 weeks or 4. I don't see the national projection having, it's going to have relatively limited growth as well, I would predict, as it goes. So the biggest piece here, we've got domestic outs and domestic ins. That's the yellow and the blue. Those balance themselves out in other words, you can see we're going back to a trend that existed before, and that trend is the trend that has existed for the last 20 years, which is California as a net loser of population, but not by huge amounts every year. And has part of that is affordability, part of that is opportunity, and part of that is international migration, the blue line. That is probably the biggest change to this series combined to previous series, is that the international migration level here is a little bit lower than it was before. This reflects a number of things. And well, I actually will go back on that one. This reflects a number of things. And one of the things that this reflects to a certain extent is the fact that, and this was an article in the New York Times earlier this week, perhaps you saw it or not, California is not as attractive to international immigrants as they were at one time. We used to get 27% of all legal immigrants to the United States in California. And a vast majority of those, probably over 50% of that, came to SCAG, came to the Los Angeles region. We're down to something, depends, on the year, but we're down to about 22% of international migrants to the United States coming to California. It says 5%. What does it mean? Well, it does mean that this pool of immigrants coming to California is less. And, perhaps problematically for some of the future pieces, they also are a little bit older than they were previously. And this causes issues, at least with the birth thing, because if they're younger immigrants, they're going to have children here, and first generation children and immigrants are slightly more likely to have more children than the native born population. Since we are attracting fewer immigrants, and the immigrants that we are attracting are a little bit older, they're not quite as in terms of maintaining that level of population in the future. They're not quite as helpful. They're vital for the labor force, very important for other things from a demographic, future demographic perspective. They're a little bit weaker when it comes to that. Part of the reason why, we have this domestic outmigration and the immigration that we exist is, I can't stress enough that some of those trends, recent trends and trends that go in the future are indeed, shaped by affordability. We gain traditionally we have had, a lot of immigration, a lot of migration to California from both domestic and internationally in the 18 to 39 range. And we've had, sort of out migration from the 40 to, sort of 59 range. We don't actually lose too many baby boomers, or we don't lose too many retirees. There's a little blip there, but most people who have been in California or born in California or moved here, during the 80s, the vast majority of individuals stay here in California. They may not stay in where they are right now. They might move to someplace else in California, but they do stay in California. So what we really see is this 40 to 59-year-olds. Those are the individuals that moved a lot. Those are the individuals that move a lot. And I don't, that doesn't really quite change, even if, even if the affordability of other states, let's say it like that, and other metro areas has gotten worse, right? I mean, there's no one place out there that people can point to right now and go, wow, it's so cheap out there. Let's move there. We can get a huge house for nothing. The last couple of years have changed that as well. But there's still a drive and a desire as individuals start into that range to sort of move from California and look for their things elsewhere. On the immigration side, the issue that we're faced with there is, yes, we have fewer immigrants. They're a little bit older. And partially this is because their areas of where they're coming from are a little bit different than they have been in the past. And it's also true that other states, immigrants like to go to places that have other immigrants already there because it provides an opportunity and an ease of being able to ease into a new culture. Well, we aren't the only, it's not just New York and California anymore. We're not the only two, states in the game, if you will. There are large pools of immigrants in many other states at this particular point in time. And that well of attractiveness is now spread out across more places in the United States than it was previously. And there's some things you can do to change that, but to a certain extent, it's not too much the state can do. That's a question about those immigrants then moving and where they feel comfortable going to. And certainly, getting we are 12% of the United States population. To get 22% or 23% of the nation's immigrants, that's significant. And most of this does not change that whatsoever, but that's an element that exists here as well. So, looking at SCAG and et cetera, because this is the sort of issue that exists in there. Right, here's the South Coast. So that's LA and actually probably includes San Diego as well, now that I'm thinking about it, but it's really LA, Orange and San Diego. I realize it's not quite in SCAG, but I mean, and here you see what really bites in there is, yes, this idea that, look, we have considerable amount of sort of mortality and natural increase. LA and Orange are a little bit older, obviously, than the Inland Empire and other parts of SCAG and California because of the nature of who moved here. And so when, assuming that lots of individuals who are over 65 don't move out, mortality begins to take hold and push us down a little bit. Inland Empire, like I say, is a little bit younger and tends to attract individuals that are intent on, having children, and so they maintain a little bit higher level of migration and a little bit less mortality, and end up with slight growth across this forecast horizon as it goes along. I mean, I think the piece that we need to think about here is we have this demographic dividend. It's not quite as extreme or whatever, but really, in some ways, the demographic dividend that we've enjoyed for the last 30, 40, 50 years is indeed sort of running its course. And that's what, that's what these are really in here. It's running its course by the 2040s. The dependency ratios on both sides of this, we don't have as much young age dependency ratio, but the old age dependency ratio is going to be a little bit of a drag on the overall nature and population dynamics in California. But the thing that's driving that, I mean, to a certain extent, is this question of affordability, and the question, because that would change migration patterns, that would change coastal to inland migration patterns, and really be, would be the biggest thing that would fundamentally change a lot of these trends.
Thank you, Walter. And that is, I think, an excellent segue into David's talk.
Thank you, Walter. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Thank you. So today I want to actually shift our attention. I want to bring attention to a very important event that took place over the summer. And that was the Census Bureau finally released the 2020 census data. And a very important event for us because now we're able to actually start doing research and start doing analysis on what those trends were. So finally, we got the Census Bureau released. So what does the 2020 census now finally reveals? And this is what we're starting analyzing over the summer. And for that, I want to actually thank the USC Pop Dynamics group. We're going to have a forthcoming release. We're actually going to go into details of what's actually going to happen. And we're specifically going to focus on homeownership trends. We're going to focus on trends in homeownership by ages, race, and cohorts. So we have a nagging question, right? How much did the ownership gap improve between whites and other racial groups in California and in the US? And more important, what does the 2020 census reveals in comparison to earlier decades? So this is very important because now we have actually the ability to analyze 2 decades in the new millennium, right? We have the 2000, 2010, and 2020 census data for that. I want to bring attention that during the 2020 census demographic and housing characteristics, only 10 variables were available. It's not a big census, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on 4. We're going to focus on age, on race, Hispanic or Latino origin, and housing tenure. And it's very important for us because specifically housing tenure is going to tell us what housing demographic trends are taking place, not only in California, but throughout the nation. More set of questions. Did homeownership actually increase in the past decade? That's something important. Did it happen more in California than in the United States? And another very important question is, are millennials and other younger generations actually keeping up with homeownership trends? So that's something that we're going to answer. What happened in the United States between 2010 and 2020? The homeownership rate in 2020 was 63.1% in the US. In 2010, it was 65.1. So we actually have a -2 percentage point decrease. That is something that happened in the United States. I do have to mention, there's a note that homeownership rates are defined as owners that are divided by all households. So what happened in California? In California, changes between 2010 and 2020 were actually very similar. The homeownership rate in 2020 was 54.5, and it actually in 2010 was a little higher. It wasn't as bad as overall in the US average, but it still went down 1.4 percentage points. I want to bring attention to something very important. Overall, when you are comparing the different age groups, you're able to see different trends. And it's very important to do so, specifically now with the decennial data. Now we're able to see that in 2020, almost every single group was below. So we actually are at a deficit. The most important trend is that California actually follows the pattern that takes place in the United States. But there's one group specifically that is also, that the decline was far worse. And that group is the group 35 and 44. Why is it so important to take or pay close attention to that specific group? As we all know, there's always a deficit now with younger generations as far as housing or homeownership. So paying attention to this group that is entering the housing market and there's already a deficit, that means that the trends are actually going to continue. So let's pay closer attention to this specific group. Once we start analyzing this data of ownership, we can see that the decline actually takes place throughout the United States, not only in California. In this specific graph, we're able to see when we are comparing the age group 35 and 44, that throughout the United States, their homeownership is declining everywhere. In comparison to the US average, there are a few states that are doing better, but overall, everyone is in a decline. If we bring specific attention to our state in California, we're faring a little better than the national average, but we're still down. When it comes to 35 and 44, we are also at a very big deficit. So that's something that we should pay attention. So how do different race and ethnic groups fare in California and their homeownership trends? Here on this graph, we're able to see that the comparison between ethno-racial groups in California, there are actually two groups that fare better than anyone else. Hispanic and Latinos pretty much stay the same, but they went up something minuscule. Asians and Pacific Islanders are actually in the upward trend, and they're doing and faring much better than any other group. But overall, the total homeownership rate in California is on a downward trend. Let's focus on two specific groups in particular. I'm going to try to focus specifically on African Americans and Hispanic or Latino. With regards to African Americans, the white black home ownership is actually on a decline. And we can see it in this comparison of 50 states. And we divided it into regional comparisons. And we're actually able to see that California is actually doing far better than the US average. In comparison to other states that we're usually in competition with, we're able to see that Texas and Florida are faring much worse. I must also bring attention that New York, another state that we're also competing, is doing much better than us. But now on a regional scale, we're able to see that in the southern region, overall, most of their states are faring much better than the US average. This may be in part because of historical populations, that African-American populations living there. With regards to Hispanic home ownership, they're actually gaining in newer destinations. And that's a trend that is that is actually new in 2020. We're able to see in this regional comparison that in the southern region, Hispanics are actually gaining a lot of home ownership. Perhaps those states, the households are still not as big, so they don't make a big dent on the US average. But this is an interesting comparison that is taking place, not only in the southern region, but also in the Northeast region. If we pay close attention, California really didn't change much. We pretty much stayed the same. We broke even. Another state that broke even was New Mexico. If we look in comparison to other states like Texas and Florida, we're able to see that Texas and Florida actually did worst. New York, once again, is on the upward trend. So now let me move and place attention a little bit now into homeownership gaps between white and other ethno-racial groups. When comparing 2020 homeownership gaps, we're able to see that in the United States, the gaps are actually far greater. In California, we're doing much better. That's a little bit of good news for us. Shifting now into age and cohort demographics, we're able to see that specifically a cohort, their trajectory is measured and it's actually defined by the actual path of the people on the average as they grow older. So they move every 10 years, they keep getting older and they continue to move within the same cohort. It's a lifelong membership. We are able to see now that white cohort change from 2000 to 2020. We're able to see that similar trends between the US and California. They follow a very similar pattern. Nonetheless, we're able to see that younger generations are lagging behind, they're falling behind. In this particular graph, we're able to see that the dotted line, those are millennials. And we can see that their trend is shifting downwards. They're not going to be able to match to the previous generations. In California, whites are actually faring worst. You're able to see that there was a downshift trend, and particularly with Gen X generation. And in the chart, you can see that is the circle, the white circles, that's the Generation X. You start seeing that shift downwards at that particular point in time. Millennials are actually moving down, and they may not be able to catch up. With regards to African Americans, you see drastic changes. And this is actually something alarming. Both in the US and in California, almost every generation is shifting downwards and is far worse than the previous generations. In some cases, even 5 percentage points lower than the prior generation. You are able to see somewhat of an upward shift in the later generations, like older generations. And perhaps that's reason for African Americans probably life expectancy being longer. But if you see it with regards to millennials, the results are actually very alarming. The Hispanic cohort is actually following a very similar pattern, both in the US and in California. Millennials are actually faring and doing good in comparison to other groups. Once again, in California, the Generation X Hispanic cohort was hit pretty hard. You're able to see it once again with the white circle that is shifting downwards. It really hasn't recovered from the recession in 2008. The only group that is doing really well, both in the US and in California, is the Asian and Pacific Islander cohort. They're following a similar trend, almost identical. Yes, older generations are doing worse and they're exiting the homeownership households, but overall, millennials are doing really well. And this is actually very surprising, specifically in California with high prices. So with that, I want to end with just a few points, a few takeaways. And we're actually able to see that homeownership isn't a decline, but it's not even throughout the US. It's changing. Every state is very different. Some states are doing far worse. California overall is doing okay in comparison to the US average. And what we can take away is that the broader younger generations need a lot of space to catch up. Thank you.
Thank you both. I have a feeling the audience is going to have lots of questions. So does anyone have any questions for our panelists? I see a hand up there, and if you can turn your mic on to ask, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Margaret Clark. I'm Mayor Pro Tem in the city of Rosemead, and I'm on the regional council here at SCAG. And one of my frustrations with the new housing bills that are coming down, they're blaming cities for the homeless population and for the low home ownership that we're talking about. And I'm very concerned about the effect in the Black community and the Hispanic community, that these are very disturbing trends. And we have no tools to build the housing. We don't build it, we zone for it. And if there's no money for lower income subsidies, we can't do it. So these bills that they're coming down are taking away our local control so that they're gifts to developers. They can come in and build luxury housing, and there's no requirement for low income because we can't afford it. There's no money. We had it with redevelopment, and then that was taken away. I loved redevelopment, but they took it away, so we have no tools. So my question is, can we get this? Gentrification is happening in the Black community, and there were 2 TV shows during COVID, The Equalizer and The Neighborhood, where they used the term gentrification. And when I was lobbying against these bills in Sacramento, I said, Hollywood gets it. Why doesn't Sacramento? So my question is there any way that we can get the business community, all of you folks in the room, to lobby for money for building the low-income housing? Because this is just going to get worse if we don't. Thank you.
Either one of you want to tackle? I know Walter can't advocate for anything as a state employee, so I'll get him off the hook there. But just thoughts about what types of policy interventions could help.
Our research right now is primarily focusing on doing analytics on where we're at and where we stand. And we're definitely, or in particular, my own research is going to start focusing on particular, like maybe suggest different policies to the policymakers to what they can actually do in the future. But the first step right now is this, right? Like actually see where we stand, where we're at, and see the trends that happen between all this definitely this 2 decades, and try to see what happened after the Great Recession, and see how this younger generations could actually get access to home ownership, which is important, especially with the group that 35 and 44 that we mentioned.
Thank you. This makes my point. I love these. I mean, I'm sad, but I love these statistics that we can use to lobby, because we're going to hurt the low-income minority people. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I also can't advocate or lobby. I work for a nonprofit. But in terms of what the research suggests about the types of funding strategies that work are things like funding for constructing affordable housing, housing subsidies so that people can live where they choose to live. And that maybe that's an opportunity for SCAG to do more. I know you do lots of work around affordable housing, but maybe another workshop, start the first annual housing and demographic workshop. I saw another hand over here. And Dowell, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about immigration. Dr. Schwarm, you had immigration being constant for like 40 years at a very low level. Historically, California has benefited from high immigration. It's a source of workers, a source of new parents, new babies, new taxpayers. And don't you think that, so is your projections assuming that California no longer has attraction to the immigrants in the world, it won't rebound? And is it subject to any political changes in future presidential administrations? Or, I mean, how sure are you it's going to hold constant at that low level?
No, I don't see that the constant is a course of assumption, because to a certain extent, what do we know about 2045 or 2050 in terms of how the world looks and how, anything else looks? So, one could theoretically look at the current, sort of employment structure and sit there and go, well, we would probably need people in order for that. And where are they going to come from? Either they're going to come from the US or they're going to come from abroad. But that also then brings the fact that, are they going to be there abroad as well? The entire world, short of a few places, is also aging at this particular point in time. And so some of the same, sort of forces that are at work in the United States and in California are also, there out in the world. It is Dal does point out, I mean, this is a political problem. I mean, part of this is, look, legally, for legal immigrants to the United States, we generally take in about 1 million in the United States. We've done that for the last 20 years or something like that. Notice the United States has grown over that time period. And so 1 million individuals in 2000 versus 1 million individuals in 2022, that's a lower rate. that is a political issue there to success. So we've got two things that are going on. The population that's here has gotten a little bit larger. So so by rights, we should be able to take in some more immigrants. If we're taking in them at the same level that we did in past, we're not. And then, as I point out, there are other pockets of sort of, and we're focusing on, it could be the case that some of those immigrants that had moved to Colorado or Texas or something like that eventually come back to California, deciding that they don't like it there. So kind of the reverse of what I've always said, which is immigrants come to California, they get an establishment here, and then they forge out to other states and form part of our domestic migration. Nothing says that that wouldn't reverse either. 140K is, I would consider, you notice it ramps up to that thing in 2032, 2033. That's actually quite aggressive right now. We will have, last year it was in the low 90s. This year it'll probably be in around 100. So based on the preliminary thing. So an additional, getting that is a problem between both our attractiveness to, versus other states, and also purely this question about, is the US immigration system broken or not? And is there political will to change it if we do need something else? And that is obviously a DC question. And we'd have to ask ourselves, how likely is it that we end up with with that changing anytime soon, right? Because it needs to change relatively. It can't be changed in 2040. It needs to be changed before that.
In the middle.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Parfrey. I'm with an organization, Climate Resolve. And by the title of the organization, I'm telegraphing what my question is going to be. Do you think there are exogenous events, and piggybacking on what Dr. Myers asked, where Southern California has a very pleasant climate? The ocean influence part of Southern California is a very nice climate. There will be other parts of the United States and other parts of the globe that are projected to become exceedingly hot. And could that be, let me just put it this way, is the Department of Finance taking those kind of climatic events into account in its projections?
No, it's as a baseline series, and which is not to say that we won't. In other words, I do intend on producing scenarios this time, and one of those might be a climate change scenario, but as a general rule, natural disasters and various other things don't exist in here. My one comment to that would be, if we're already facing a crisis of affordability and of housing production within the climate, within the coastal areas, to envision that suddenly we're going to be able to encompass many, many more individuals migrating to those areas would require a significant change in policy.
A question here. Oh.
Hi, I'm John Hedderson. I'm a private demographer, but I worked for decades with LA County and long time off and on California resident. And I noticed personally since the 1960s that every 15 years or so, there's a crash in the housing market. In the early 90s, I managed to lose a significant percentage of property value when I had to sell a home in La Cañada. And so the idea that housing just gets progressively more expensive in California has not been my experience. I wanted to get some comments on that, but I have also kind of a technical question. In the 1990 census showed more people than expected in California, and I think part of that was because of the Immigration Reform Act legalized many people who were then easier to count. And I think if we have some kind of adjustment in immigration status of people, we'll get a better count, especially for LA County, which may have maybe 10%, maybe 1 million people who are undocumented and very difficult to count. So just throwing those out as things that might cause the counted population to be higher, and also to make the housing market. Are you taking into account that the housing market goes down as well as up in price?
David, do you want to speak to the housing cost?
Specifically in California, we saw a declining in prices after the Great Recession. Unfortunately, that was probably the best time for younger generations to actually jump into the market. But unfortunately, at the time, the financial institutions were not in place to actually offer loans or offer incentives for people to actually get into the homeownership trend. And I think that's why the reason why we actually see this drop, right? Significant drop, especially with Generation X. What's going to happen later? I really don't know. The prices continue to go up. I know rates continue to go up, so maybe that will stop it a little bit. But it's something that we're going to have to continue monitoring.
And I mean, I'll maybe leave the housing question to another day, but in terms of, the question of the undocumented, I mean, our assumption has always been that the census does an adequate job of capturing them, particularly with outreach and et cetera. Are there, is that the case? There's really no way to know, right? I mean, a count of the undocumented is difficult because they are indeed undocumented and in the shadows. We hope that they did fill out the census. There was much outreach to try and get them to do that. So in which case they would be baked in. I mean, the one thing we do see is, to a certain extent, that even if they are undocumented, they are still having children and they are still, to a certain extent, some dying here as well. And so their existence would be reflected within those trends, obviously. And hopefully, we don't, and as such, one would not have to actually, sort of modify them in.
And to speak to the completeness of the 2020 census count, although it was one of the most challenging the Census Bureau has probably ever experienced, California had a really robust complete count effort, more so than probably any other state. And the count of total population, including those who are authorized and unauthorized, was closer to estimates that DOF was using based on births and deaths and administrative records than probably any other state. And California's undercount was basically non-existent in the 2020 census, all people considered. Comey?
Yeah, this is a quick question for David. I was intrigued by your presentation because it was counterintuitive to what most of us believe in terms of how California fares against the rest of the country in terms of homeownership and all that. But I was just wondering where you have cohorts performing better, like the Hispanic millennials and Asian Pacific. Are there any specific factors that sort of delineate why that is the case for those groups?
I think specifically California has to be the high prices, like it's very expensive to actually purchase a home in California. But nonetheless, what the biggest trend that I noticed with the data is that millennials are actually mirroring, to some extent, like the older generation that was like behind them. So they're actually doing okay. They're not doing great. They can do better. And for that, that's something that we may have to implement, for example, like incentives or program incentives that could actually make them or ease their way into homeownership. I think the biggest issue with almost every group was the Generation X was hit pretty hard during the Great Recession, and they still haven't recovered from that.
Yeah, but I think the question was more, why are Hispanics doing so well compared to others?
Okay.
And Asian Pacific Islanders.
I think with regards to Hispanics, I'm going to bring up this term. I know this, you probably guys have heard a lot. There's a very resilient group. So in so many cases, they actually pair up two families into one home. Multiple income earners go into a loan to be able to purchase a property. So I think there's many factors, but I think those factors specifically here in California, I've been noticing those trends that take place.
I think we have time for one more question, and I saw a hand there. Oh, the mic is off. There we go.
I wanted to ask, when you were referring to the 2020 census, I know in the early months of the release, they were very concerned with, and they knew there was the greatest undercount was among the children. Do you know if what the latest on that is? You say California had the least undercount, but are you also including children below 18?
It's an excellent question. And yeah, so the organization that I work for has done a lot of research specifically on the undercount of young children.
Mm-hmm.
So I could we can talk more during the break
That'd be
about the
great.
specifics.
Yeah.
But yes, there was still an undercount of youngest children. By young children, for those of you who are not familiar with this, we mean under age 5. Kids under age 10 were undercounted. Under age 5 was the most highly undercounted age group. And that is consistent across all states. When I say California's count was really close, I mean total population. For undercounts, it's undercounts of young children, undercounts of Native Americans living in tribal areas, undercounts of renters. So there are some pluses and minuses, and that on net, California's count was very close. But yes, there were still some groups undercounted.
All right, thank you.
Walter.
Well, yeah, I'll just point out that this not so much, because this is still based fundamentally on the 2010 census run forward. We've done some adjustments, but data that's been coming out yesterday will help fix that. We plan on using the blended base from the Census Bureau, which is the Bureau's own attempt within their population estimates program to fix some of these problems, like the undercount of children and the undercount of various other things. And so, we do plan on basing this next projection series on as much as the blended base as we can get, and that therefore would sort of fix some of those problems.
And that's what, 2010, 2020? Is that the blended base?
The blended base is it's essentially Census 2020 with some with some research done around it, some additions to it, and in order to try and fix some of the undercount issues, in particular the young children undercount issues, because that has been a perennial issue.
Yes, it has. And just a quick comment about the affordability, housing affordability. I did work with a affordable housing nonprofit years ago, and I just want to say one thing is at least the organizations in this LA County area, they are very good at managing their generally it's a rental market, but if you look at the housing that is developed by affordable housing nonprofits, it's usually probably one of the nicest buildings on the block, and it also is managed very well over time. And I say that because another perennial issue is the NIMBYism around having affordable housing in a neighborhood. But also, you are right. I'm thinking that we need to get a statewide redevelopment law back in place. And I don't know if you know how come we don't have it anymore. We had one of the largest developers here in LA who challenged that developer fee, and therefore legally through the courts, we couldn't as local agencies collect those fees for a pool. And so that just decimated the monies, the pot of money. So I'm thinking that's really would be great to get that back, because as an affordable housing nonprofit, try to find money. But what you have to do is compete through tax credits, through private investments, and the amount of time taken up competing for these pools of money is really unfair to these organizations, and you don't get to build as much housing through it. So just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
So we are at time. And I just want to say the themes that you heard this morning about aging population, about changes in migration to the state or out of the state, and about housing affordability are going to continue to percolate through the rest of the day today. So thank our panelists.
I'm going to call it the next panel, panel 2. Connie Polini-Tipton is the chair.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that welcome. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel on data windows. So we've been hearing some themes this morning about change, and this whole workshop is really about understanding the demographic trends and the change that's ahead of us. So we have a panel of experts here who are ready to talk about housing data infrastructure and what new technology is able to give us insights into. Our panelists are going to address how the availability of housing market data is affecting the search for housing in surprising and maybe unexpected ways. So first, we're going to hear from Tim Parham, who is the Data and Innovation Unit Chief from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. He's going to describe how new and improved housing data is available. And if you're a planner or someone working on housing challenges, and you haven't seen the state's housing dashboard, this is going to be of particular interest to you. So very excited as a planner who uses housing data to have this additional tool available. So please take it away, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. Hi, everybody. Tim Parham with Housing Community Development. Nice to see you all. I'm just going to go through a brief presentation here, as Connie described. So a little bit of context about data, housing data, particularly at the state. Every 4 years, the Housing and Community Development Department puts out a statewide housing plan, which serves as a framework for really the key thing out of it is the housing need. So out of the next 8 years, the last plan was passed in 2022. We need to meet the need of 2.5 million homes over, by 2030. And 1 million of those need to be affordable for folks under 80% area median income. Ambitious targets. We've got our work cut out if you haven't heard that already from all the other panelists earlier. As sort of an appendix to that housing plan, HCD developed the data strategy, which is an ambitious 10-year data strategy informed by a work group across the state government, which evaluates data priorities, identifies data useful to enforce housing laws, and inform policy, support efforts to preserve affordable housing, protect residents, and understand the process and barriers to housing production, and consider tools and resources needed by state and local governments. I'll go on to one of the key implementation areas that we're working on in the statewide housing plan and the data strategy specifically. But one of the things, I've been with the state for just a little bit over a year, and one of the things that I've really learned in the data space is that, like, most of you, and I'm sure many of you are SCAG employees or local staff, the thing we can do best is give you quality data to do great things with. As we have time and ramping up to those 4-year cycles of statewide housing plans, we can tell you great stories, but mostly you're counting on us to not screw up the data that is provided. And that's where a lot of the efforts my team has been undertaking in the last year or so. One of those key areas is around the annual progress report. So this is a rich data source that is provided directly from local governments to the state annually in April every year. And it contains a variety of data related to housing policy and production. This group may be most interested in the data related to housing production. This also includes information on implementation of housing element programs and certain housing streamlining provisions. It seems like every new housing bill comes with a reporting requirement for local governments, and most of that information goes into the annual progress report. And, you know, some recent ones are highlighted on here: AB 2011 and SB 6 from a year ago, allowed housing in commercial zones. There's changes to the form that will track projects that are entitled that way. So think of APRs in a nutshell as a way to track projects from entitlement through construction, and you know, relating that to how those units were produced in regards to different policies and programs. And one of the things we're really proud of, I don't have a link on the slideshow, but happy to share it afterwards, is we've created a dashboard with this data for the annual progress reports. It's great. There's a lot to it. I almost feel like you need a guide to go through it. It's so rich, but there's tutorials we can provide and that sort of thing. But one of the things our team looked into for this conversation was specifically around accessory dwelling units. So attached, detached accessory units. There's been a lot of state bills around that in the past few years. And specifically what we're looking at here is from 2018 to 2022 in this region. what's happening with ADUs. So ADU streamlining provisions have encouraged ADU production statewide and have been a bright spot for overall housing production statewide and in the SCAG region. This slide shows overall permits for ADUs increasing along with a share of permits reported as ADUs have been steadily increasing since 2018. Demographic factors play a part in the market conditions that make ADUs an attractive option. Shrinking household sizes, aging present a natural reason to adapt single-family houses to accommodate more than one household. And apologies that this is a little bit hard to read, but we put together a map here. The red dots are indicating ADUs permitted in the SCAG region. And the blue areas you see there are the high quality transit areas identified in your region. And so ADUs help increase density in areas with existing residential uses and infrastructure. Really impressive. Kudos to this region for leaning into accessory dwelling units. 30,000 ADUs have been permitted in this region since 2018. That's a great number. Another way that we use the annual progress report data is in maps. And really excited about a new map tool that came out about 6 months ago, which combines data from the annual progress reports with sites identified by jurisdictions in their housing element, site inventories to show both sites that are identified by locals as suitable for housing development, but also those that are surplus government owned or publicly owned land. And just a brief snapshot of what that tool can do. You can type in, a developer could look for a 40-acre site in Riverside County that is declared surplus land, and it spits out a table of potential properties to pursue. So with that, I just wanted to give a brief snapshot of our annual progress report data, what it can do. There's a ton of great data tools that our team and other teams at HCD have put out available on our website. I encourage you to peruse, reach out to us if you have any questions. And I have 3 more slides that I think I'm obligated by HCD to do, which are just like plugs. What I'll say about it is one of the demographic trends that I think was mentioned earlier is telework. I live in San Marcos, and honestly was super surprised that HCD of all places like leaned into the remote work as much as they did, but it makes a lot of sense because everybody brings a different perspective. We need folks in the Southern California region as well as across the state. So I'm grateful for that. I'm happy to talk more offline, but with that, I'll hand it back to Connie or turn it over to Jeff.
Yep, I will take it. Is there, Del, did I sense you had a question for us? No, okay. All right, well, we're appreciative too. And again, I think that HCD is doing a remarkable job bringing data to jurisdictions. I know representing the city of Los Angeles, we depend on that data and really appreciate the new efforts at tracking our housing development. This conference is really about demographics, but you'll note there's extreme focus on housing. And I think it's because that's the one thing that we can influence as planners, as decision makers, rather than maybe we don't have as much to say about immigration policy. So we definitely want to be able to continue to influence the development of housing. So here to tell us a little bit more about how we're tracking and understanding housing data in particular, we have Jeff Boeing, who's the Assistant Professor and Director of Urban Data Lab at USC. Jeff has been looking at that availability of data, and he has some surprising insights into how it might be further influencing the segregation of access to housing. So interested to hear what Jeff can tell us about housing data.
Connie. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the housing search is changing. And although I'm on the data panel here, I'm not going to actually present any data to you, which may be a breath of fresh air for some of you in the room. Instead, I want to think a little bit more abstractly about data as information. So both information for home seekers, also information for us as policymakers and planners, and how we can reason with this changing housing search. So first off, by housing search, all I mean is the process by which we find housing. I'm going to be focusing primarily on finding rental housing, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about today applies to the home buying market as well. And all of this is filtered through this lens of digitalization, which is just a jargony buzzword for meaning moving things to computers, specifically moving things online. And over the past few years, the housing search in particular has moved rapidly online. So that is moving to platforms like Craigslist and Facebook, different language platforms like apartamentos.com or gosection8.com. And these platforms have come to dominate the information exchange. So by that, I just mean the way that we announce and convey that there is a unit available, and the way that we acquire that information and communicate with the landlord to apply for it and get more information about unit characteristics. So about 5 years ago, the AHS, the American Housing Survey, revealed that for the first time, more renters used a website like Craigslist and its peers to find their current home than any other information channel. And that change comes with benefits, drawbacks, and it's not always clear for whom. So first, the benefits. Digitalization promises a few things. So first off, it allows us to target specific niches. That is, rather than just having one ad for everyone to see, it's a little bit easier to get niche. If you can get millions of eyeballs on your ad, you'll find the one or two people who might specifically line up with what you've got. We can also diversify our information supplies as consumers. So that is, we're able to see a lot more stuff if we have access to everything online, rather than just my local regional newspaper or war driving around my neighborhood looking for rent signs. In turn, that expands our choice sets and our search radii. So we have more units available to look at, and we can look much, much further than ever before as information is broadcast. And in turn, that reduces our search costs. So it takes a lot less time to look at the same number of units. And we're able to cut down on information asymmetries, where we all have access to the same information. And that hopefully will help diminish some of the traditional gatekeeping, such as realtors steering different racial or ethnic groups toward different kinds of housing units. Again, in theory, because what could possibly go wrong with that promise of digitalization? So a few things that we often end up seeing in practice. So first off, privileged communities could be using these platforms more, reducing their search costs, having more access to information, and reinforcing a lot of the traditional disparities in the housing market that we've often seen. There could also be information self-segregation. That is, different kinds of people choose to use different platforms and communicate among themselves, reinforcing those traditional segregation patterns in the housing market. Of course, there are important privacy concerns anytime we're sharing information online, and new gatekeepers could emerge. So even if we break down some of those gatekeeper barriers from landlords, tenants could increasingly serve as gatekeepers themselves, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. So in the end, what we like to talk about is this democratization of information on the internet. Often ends up being a faux democratization that looks like democratization, has the trappings of it, but often ends up reinforcing the powerful and continuing to undermine the most vulnerable among us. So in that context, for the rest of this talk, I want to focus on 3 ongoing currents of research in this space. Very briefly, those are information broadcasting, non-traditional forms of residential mobility, and then lastly, new data for policymakers and what we might be able to do about all of this. So first, we've been talking about that idea of information broadcasting a little bit already, but I want to reflect on it a bit more. So first off, the traditional market has always emphasized personal relationships, private connections, and physical proximity in how we look for housing to live in. The digital market's very different. Instead, we can exchange information in public where anyone can see it, anyone has access to it, and so the same information gets every pair of eyeballs on it in the same way, which is important because ideally that should help us escape some of those socio-structural factors that have shaped the housing search. So traditionally we know that where you grow up, where you're familiar with is where you tend to look and where you tend to have connections. And so we end up getting stuck in place a lot of the time. But maybe we can overcome some of that racial steering and gatekeeping that historically has existed. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence has been more mixed. So in a couple of current research projects that I've done with some graduate students, we found that housing seekers in whiter, wealthier, better educated, higher income neighborhoods tend to have a surplus of information available to them online in those kinds of communities to help their searches. While neighborhoods, the other kinds of neighborhoods, lower income minority neighborhoods tend to face an information deficit, which just mimics historical patterns in the housing search. Listings in communities with more Black, Latino, and poorer residents in particular contain less information and disproportionately focus on tenant disqualifications, whereas in whiter, wealthier communities, it focuses on unit amenities and qualifications. This raises a question of, here do we have information inequality? Or are these lower income minority communities perhaps being shielded from processes like gentrification in this redoubt of digital illegibility? So that is, if whiter, wealthier people tend to look online for housing units, if these communities don't appear as much online, perhaps they're being shielded from the gentrification processes and colonialism of the housing search if they can't be seen online. This also shapes non-traditional residential mobility, specifically economic mobility through longer distance housing searches, when you don't have to be in person and look locally in a community, when you don't need to know who's who to be able to find a housing unit. It makes it easier for intermetropolitan movers to rely on things other than personal networks and specific platforms. Also opens up this new trend in shared housing beyond its traditional role for college students and family-based units, where we can share individual housing units by matching with other tenants on both unit characteristics that we need and also personal characteristics that make us a good match to live together. But that comes back to what I mentioned earlier about tenants as gatekeepers, where it's totally valid to discriminate based on personal characteristics when you're looking for a roommate. But at the same time, that calls into question how we present ourselves online, what makes certain roommates desirable or undesirable. And that gatekeeping can reinforce a lot of traditional segregation patterns as well. So I want to conclude by thinking, aside from consumer information, what information is there from these online housing search platforms that we may be able to take advantage of as planners and policymakers? So first, overall, the data exhaust from these platforms. So these data trails that these platforms collect and leave behind can show us the pulse of the housing market in something approximating real time for the first time. So we have both quantitative data that we can use to develop dashboards, monitor real-time affordability conditions. There's also, importantly, underused qualitative data to help us understand the language of inclusion and exclusion, these gray areas of illegal language about who is or isn't welcome to apply for a specific housing unit. As policymakers, I think our responsibility is to try to foster the benefits of these housing search platforms as an equalizing force that reduces search costs and increases choice sets, while try to mitigate some of the harms, specifically around reinforcing and reproducing traditional forms of segregation. We can use these platforms to monitor market conditions, but we need to be wary of selection bias. People choose which platforms to use based on their personal characteristics, and we're not getting representative samples when we look at something like Craigslist or Facebook. And there aren't really guidelines today for data collection and privacy by these platforms. This is an important space for policymaking to step in to fill the gap, to identify what information must or must not be collected here to try to be a more equalizing force. And then lastly, we have an opportunity to try to create and build more targeted platforms, specifically to make choice neighborhoods more accessible to more vulnerable communities. So perhaps hand selecting available rental units or creating a registry where people can post information to help with residential mobility into neighborhoods of choice. So in conclusion, these platforms can often reproduce real-world power dynamics because markets are so segmented and hyper-local. They're entrenched in customs. There are often traditional information asymmetries that get reproduced online, including the self-segregation, but there are a lot of opportunities both for us to intervene in this space to make these platforms work more equally, but also to harvest information from them for planning and policy making. If you're interested in talking a little more about harvesting that information, I'm going to hold that for the Q&A, but I'd be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We're going to turn now to the hybrid portion of our presentation from our panel. So I'm just making sure that we have Elizabeth Garner here. She's there she is. I see her. Welcome, Elizabeth. She's our Colorado State demographer. So bringing an outside perspective to this discussion this morning. She's going to touch on, I think, some of the themes that Dr. Schwarm started to talk about with our national trends that we're observing. So I thought it was very interesting. He gave a shout out to Colorado earlier, indicating that we might see more people coming back to California from Colorado. I'd love to know what Elizabeth has to say about that statement. So she's here virtually, and she looks like she's ready to go. So I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
I just first, I'm going to do a check. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And can you see the screen?
We cannot see the screen, but there might be a delay. Oh, there it is. We're good.
Perfect. So again, thank you so much actually for the invitation to be here today. And I've loved all of your sessions. So this has been really informative for me. And I think that there's a lot that, that we can learn from these, from different states and what they're going through. So I'm going to actually tie some pieces from what Walter was talking about, and then what the two other speakers today was talking about, and especially in the concept of kind of data and then translating that into information. Because ultimately what we need to be able to do is, collect really good data, but then put it into a format of information so that people can make decisions. A lot of us, we're in a similar office where we're not a policy group. We are strictly a data and information group. And so just a little bit about our office and what we do, probably kind of similar to Walter's shop. But the biggest piece is that, we create data and information for state agencies and local governments and nonprofits, et cetera, for decision making. Try and do it in a neutral, nonpartisan, non-policy format. And we're a pretty small shop, but we definitely create the economic and demographic forecasts as well as GIS and mapping. But maybe even more importantly, we provide a lot of technical assistance, training, and outreach, and over 130 presentations a year kind of on this data and information and how it can be used. Just a little plug for our website, always looking for feedback. Demography.dola.colorado.gov if you're interested in looking at how we put together the different data sets and information. And definitely I want to take a look at the housing dashboard. How do we talk about housing and those components? So I learned a lot, I think, today already about some ideas. But what I do want to talk about is some summary things about Colorado and what's going on here, and similarities, differences between what we're seeing in California. Obviously, one of the biggest things that we're seeing is this population is growing, but it's slowing in the US as well, but certainly impacting Colorado. Migration and mobility is slowing down. I think that's something that certainly California is thinking about dealing with, is what that impact will be, but certainly harder and harder to attract and retain the best and the brightest. For us, part of the narrative has to be about this concept that job growth drives population growth, which I'll get into in a minute. But it's important to be able to talk about that with decision makers. And then for Colorado, certainly, and I think it's probably impacting California as well, is age is impacting everything. Consumer demands, tax revenues, participation in the labor force. And then I think what you've seen both in housing as well as probably in your economy is that we're really seeing this growth in our diversity from our youngest ages and looking at that implication. So for Colorado, if we look at population trends over time, I use this graph with a lot of decision makers to show a couple of things. It starts in 1970. It shows those components of population change, natural increase in the blue, red is the net migration. We are a positive net migration state, except for a couple of those years in the 80s. But the fact that it's been slowing down, and this is even where media is important, because in media, people are talking all the time, oh, this exponential growth, everybody flocking to the state. I'm like, wait a minute, no, we've seen population growth slowing. So if we're still feeling uncomfortable, if we're still having issues, maybe we need to look at something different, because it isn't necessarily the population growth. But I do want to talk about that slowdown a little bit, because we talk about this a lot in terms of labor force and housing. But I do want to show this graph in terms of, if we look at those components, we have started to see those births slow down, right? In the US as a whole as well, we're down about 8,000 fewer births per year. I know we're a baby state compared to California. But we can also see that increase in deaths simply because we're aging. Very natural. You can see the little tick up there from COVID. But I also want to point out net migration, which is the green line, really follows this business cycle. We can see this boom and bust. Within that net migration, it follows a lot of our job growth as well. But we are forecasting it to boom back, not boom back, return a little bit, and then start to slow down. And a lot of that has to do with age, and age in the country, and population slowing in the country as a whole. But I do want to talk about those births a little bit, because we are panicked about it. If we look in the United States as a whole, I think we're down about 625,000 fewer births per year than we had in the peak year in 2007. So the US as a whole over the decade was down about 1 million people in the under 18 population, simply due to this slowing in birth. On this map of the US, red, orange, peach are states that had positive growth in the under 18 population. Colorado grew by about 38,000, about 5% of our total growth was in that under 18. But all of the shades of blue are states that had an absolute decline in that under 18. And this is where we're concerned, because California, Midwest, Northeast are the largest donors to our higher ed system, paying out-of-state tuition, and to our labor force coming in as that net migrant. So we are looking at those implications of what this means. And so this is helpful to talk with decision makers in Colorado about the implication of this slowdown in birth. I also then talk about net migration and its relationship to job growth. And probably a similar challenge that California has had, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. People all of the time in Colorado are complaining about people. They're like, just too many people. People on the roads, people in the houses, people on the ski slopes. And I'm like, all right, fine. You might not be a fan of people, but tell me what you think about jobs. Across the board, everyone is pro job growth. More jobs all of the time. Doesn't matter where you are. But then I try and talk to them about the fact that a job is a person, and a housing unit is where that job sleeps at night. So you can't be anti-people yet pro-jobs. And we can see over time, when you have stronger job growth, which is the blue bar, you tend to have stronger net migration, which is the red line. And so that helps then start people thinking about this importance of tying all of these factors together: jobs, people, labor force, housing. We are forecasting for the state to slow down in job growth in the future, as well as net migration, primarily due to the fact that the whole US is starting to slow down. And that will have this long run implication. In terms of net migration, I think everybody's kind of referenced this today. Where do we get those net migrants for Colorado from? All of the shades of kind of red, orange, peach are states that are net donors. All of the shades of blue are where we're losing people to. And this has definitely changed over time. We're losing to more states. We see that kind of north and west loss, but also kind of almost anywhere. But our largest donors, again, California, Midwest, Northeast, we got some Southeast as well. So important to understand where we're sharing people to and from, to also understand what are the conditions in those states and if they will continue to be these donors or not, or who are our biggest competitors for labor force, primarily. I also like to talk about the labor force and job growth. In Colorado, we use this chart just kind of showing types of jobs that are growing by wage rate, because this has a long run implication as well. I don't really expect you to be able to break down and see all of the numbers here, but we have it broken down by color. So a green is a high wage job, purple is a mid-wage, red is a low wage. Why do I bring this up? Because when we're growing high wage jobs, these are folks typically that come in from other states, come in from California, come in from the Northeast. And these are states that typically have been having higher wages and higher incomes. So they come to Colorado, and even though we think our home prices are high, people come in from other states and they're like, what do you mean? These are reasonable home prices. They look at our traffic and they're like, what traffic? So all of it is a lens, also understanding who those migrants are, where they're coming from, what their wages are, and how does that compare to Colorado. Last thing I'll really talk about is age, because that's a huge impact in Colorado and really across the country. And it impacts everything that we do, and especially these areas, housing, labor force, income, and service demand. This is Colorado's age distribution broken down by single year of age. I like to do our age pyramids for everybody together, not broken by male and female, because then it really illustrates where people are. Black line is at 65. You can see that slowdown in the kiddos. Our peak person is 30. You can see the large number of people aging into that 65 plus, the different colors of the different generations. But this also helps describe where we're going to see impacts in the future, basically stronger growth on the aging population, weaker growth on the youngins. And we can tie that together with another graph looking at where we're forecasting growth over just the next decade, really illustrating that, Colorado's forecast to increase by 600,000. I know you're saying, "Aw, poor little Colorado." 600,000 over the decade, but half of that growth is in the 65 plus. And very, declines in the under 18 this decade, very slow growth in the 18 to 24, only growth in that 25 to 44, which is a key age group, if we get that net migration, with the fastest growth in that 65 plus. And again, over about 45% of our growth in this, of that 600,000 in that 65 plus. So these are not folks that are going to be in the labor force, but they're also not folks that are moving to Colorado. Colorado does not attract older adults in terms of that net migrant. We're about a 0 on the 65 plus. So the growth that we're seeing in the 65 plus is just from us aging in place. And people worry about that in the state, primarily because they think, oh, all of this growth in 65 plus, where are we going to house all of them? It's like, no, these are the folks that have already been here, or most of them are already housed. But we can use this information then to look at household forecasts by age group, put the kind of the green star and what we're looking right now. Some of the fastest growth is really in our 65 plus, slowdown in that younger population. And then we can forecast over time what that looks like. So then we can also think about that housing demand. So just, I always include implications after a data set so that people can take that data and then think about how that impact is going to be. I'm not going to go over this with you guys, but it's just those implications necessarily from age and in terms of consumer demand, labor force, and housing. I know I'm short on time, but I know that the other two are really focused on housing. This boom and bust cycle of housing, I think, is really important for all of us to be thinking about. For Colorado, that orange line is indicating new housing development. Over time, this starts in 1985, and we go into these busts, and then booms, and then busts, and that doesn't really help anyone. And it's really those lowest resourced people that lose. The blue bars are household formation, or the number of new households, our household population over time, and we can see that it doesn't marry up. And we're looking at ways, and so that's maybe my ask from you guys, we're looking at ways, how do you describe that tightness in that housing supply over time? When we know that we have these boom and bust. I've got the graph kind of on the top left, illustrating kind of that household population to housing unit ratio over time to try and figure out what is that right ratio. The average over time is that 2.25. We're now below that. Does that mean that we're at a good ratio? I don't know. I won't go into how we do our forecasts, but it really is a labor demand, labor supply is how we do our work in our state. And the nexus is then really fixed by net migration. Huge impacts in terms of national impacts, in terms of the fact that it is slowing down. We're seeing population slowing down, mobility slowing down. But these are the factors that we think about, and it might be something that we can talk about during any of the Q&A. But again, I want to thank you guys for inviting me to be part of it. I'm probably a bigger winner than you guys are. I think I've learned a lot more, but then thank you again for having me.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I know we're going to take some questions here in the audience, but also I want to check with Kevin. Are we also taking online?
We're given preference to those in person, but I have your online, and I'll feed them if we've got time.
Just wanted to let people know we are cognizant that there might be questions coming in, and we'll try and get to those. If we don't get to them during the session, we'll get to them after. So I see a hand in the back.
Yes, William Clark from UCLA. Jeff, I enjoyed your discussion of the search processes. I have a question. While I agree with you about the rental market, do you think there's been much change in the owner market where the number of units viewed, the search space is still pretty much the same, at least from my perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't look at the buying market as much. One of my colleagues at the SF Fed, who I was recently writing with, does, however. And the question there is really about how the gatekeeping is changing with tools like Zillow that let you kind of sidestep realtors a lot of the time. Where a big concern in the buying market is how steering happens among realtors to steer, say, African Americans into African American neighborhoods, whites into white neighborhoods, and so forth, which has been well documented for many decades. The hope is that tools like Zillow will equip those home seekers with a better information supply to be able to look by unit characteristics across a metro area for what's available, rather than looking within a specific neighborhood with a specific racial composition, which may help with residential integration and reducing racial segregation. But beyond that, I can't speak as much to the buying market.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I see one hand. Go ahead. Yes.
Thanks. Yes, and I wanted to mention that in terms of buying market, but the digitalization of the information, my mother sends me daily houses for sale in various areas because it is digitally available and she can search various areas. Whether or not she's buying now is not the issue. It's her aspirational sense she gives me. So I do see what you're speaking of. She can search various areas, but don't Redfin and Zillow also begin to send you homes or alert you of homes that you have already previously searched in areas you previously searched? So essentially it's going to filter and be a gatekeeper.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of what I was talking about with new forms of gatekeeping, where for home sharing, tenants become gatekeepers. We act like if an algorithm is sending you listings, then it must be unbiased, which is obviously patently false. We've just shifted the points of human intervention and the points of where we're being filtered into specific housing submarkets.
Well, and also the issue of sort of, are there biases built into that programming?
Exactly, yeah. And unfortunately, one of the things we do is we turn these into more of black boxes that become harder to measure, harder to research, and a lot harder to regulate when we pass it off.
Yeah, right. Quick question for Tim. Commenting question. We're with Los Angeles Unified School District, and we're really excited about this housing database online. One of the uses, and I don't know if that's been in your scope, for housing development data is for student generation rates, because much of our work is how many students will be generated from these new developments. And I was going to ask you, do you also have bedroom sizes? Are you tracking developments by unit, by bedroom sizes? Probably not, I'm thinking, but is that even possible to get from you folks?
No, it's a great question, and one we're trying to tackle right now as we do a big internal data push where we're essentially working really hard to connect the data that would tell us bedroom size. So that's funding data, right? So when you apply for funding, if you're a developer and you tell us what you're going to build with the funding, how many, bedroom size and all of that, we can track from entitlements to that data. Right now, it's a very labor intensive effort to do that. We can do it on case by case data, or issues, but we're working towards that sort of nuanced understanding, and then that opens up a lot more connections to demographics for sure.
We're looking forward to that one. And then I was going to ask about housing rentals and ownership. Are millennials' lifestyle choices part of that? A reduction in home ownership? Thank you.
Anyone want to take that question? If not, I do have a couple questions coming over here. Want to make sure we give people time. We have a few minutes left for maybe a last question.
I do have a couple of two from the audience here. There are a couple of questions I'll meld into one about accessory dwelling units, and I think this probably leans a little bit toward Tim's. Do we know how ADUs are being used? The shares that are actually contributing to the open rental market, or for additional space for homeowners, family, what have you? And is there kind of a sense on HCD's end of monitoring or keeping track of that for housing supply purposes more broadly?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I'm not sure exactly if we're able to track that yet, but it would be good if we could do that, because we track units by affordability levels. So I'm assuming we can tell you ADUs by deed restricted affordability levels, if that's a thing. But I don't think it's like a main effort, but we should be doing that, and I can report back on that.
Okay, thank you for those questions. And Dal, are you ready to?
No, I have a question for
okay.
Elizabeth.
Wonderful.
I want to get this in. Elizabeth, Dr. Garner, I detect an interesting philosophy in your professional stance, and I wonder if I can call you to discuss that more, or be more specific about it. On the one hand, you said that your agency is a fact-based agency; it's not a policy-making agency. But then also in your dialogue, sounds like you're interacting with a political base of local residents who are pushing back on different things, and you're trying to explain it to them. I'm curious, how do you conceptualize it? How your work goes beyond the numbers and into communicating with the public in a way that they can understand better about issues that are at root are still political. It's not policy based, I understand, but it's interesting. I'm really intrigued with your approach. Do you have any way that you can describe what your philosophy is?
I think that's a really good question, and maybe hard for me to describe. I mean, part of
Right,
it is the
yeah.
fact that I'm an economist, and so I'm always looking at both sides. So I try not to weigh if something's good or bad. I just want them to know that there are two sides. That a lot of times we get a lot of advocates or a lot of policy people that just are looking one direction, and they're not being able to see the other side of what's coming on. And so just try and make sure that people are well aware of the data and information and the implications. Because just even with the concept of growth, right? There's a lot of benefits and drawbacks. And I try not to say that growth is good, but if you don't have it, here are some implications. If you do have it, here are some implications.
Got it. Okay, so it's balanced. Got it.
Yeah, it's balanced. And I really appreciate the perspective of jobs are good. And we have to remember to have jobs as part of that conversation about housing. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I appreciate all the panelists here today. Thank you, Jeff and Tim and Elizabeth. And that concludes panel number 2.
All right,
thank you very much.
While you take your seat, Dell, first of all, I want to welcome you all back. I've seen some really interesting conversations going on in the hallway. So the earlier panels have stimulated some conversation, and I appreciate that. No, this is kind of like a wonky kind of conference with a lot of data, and we crave that around here at SCAG. So this is like it's Christmas in a way. I can't believe it's the 3rd panel already, and this panel is going to be talking about balancing the generational change with work and housing. We have 3 eminent members on this panel that will speak to the topic at hand. This panel will be looking at generational change through the lens of the region's housing and jobs, demographic factors that behind the current labor shortage, and what we can expect as we age as a region, what we expect to have happen with housing stock, which will be necessary for workers. I appreciate Elizabeth's earlier on talking about the folks like to talk about jobs, but they don't really quickly associate that to housing. And so the need for that connection, I think, is what this panel is going to try to do. I'm not going to read the bios of the panelists, so we'll just jump into it because we know we have precious little time to get through all of the information we have today. And so with that, we're going to start with Diana Elliott. She's the Vice President of U.S. Programs at the Population Reference Bureau. Diana.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to do a very high level. I mean, many of the things that we've talked about already this morning will be represented in this presentation, but this will be very high level, zooming out even to a national and international perspective. Okay, so one of the things, and I'll just start off by saying I have been driven crazy by a lot of the news stories out there that decry a labor shortage and attribute it to workers who don't want to work or low pay that's creating this. Again, as a sociologist and a demographer, I knew that there was a more complex story behind the scenes, and I felt that needed to get out there. So I wrote a blog. I've since written another blog. It's really about kind of talking about these dynamics in a more long-term way and framing them in terms of not just what's happening right now, but what's going to happen in the future and what's happening internationally as well. So a deeper understanding of demographics really helps illuminate why there aren't enough workers right now for open positions. And I'll walk through some of these very high level pieces: changing age structure, increased death rate, and stalled immigration. Again, themes that we've heard today. So this helps kind of reinforce this. So we're going to talk through these trends and why policy matters. Okay. First of all, I love this picture. This really sort of shows this joyful side of aging, right? It's aspirational. Why does the changing age structure matter? As we've discussed today, if you have people aging out of the workforce, we have a really big cohort, baby boomers, they're aging out of the workforce. And this then means there are fewer people in the labor force to work in these jobs. It's a pretty established dynamic, but putting the numbers behind it, between 2000 and 2022, the median age in our country increased by 3.4 years. We're aging as a country. The share of working age population shrank from 64.9% from a peak of 67.3% in 2007. Now that's just the share of the working age population. That's not necessarily reflective of people who are in the labor force, but it's a really important dynamic for us to think about when we make cross-national comparisons, as I'll do. All baby boomers right now can access retirement savings, their 401ks, pensions, et cetera. Most can claim Social Security. 90% are projected to stop working by 2030. So that's happening right now. And since 2007, sort of pulling off of what Walter had discussed as well, total fertility rates are well below replacement. So there's not enough people right now entering, 15, 16-year-olds entering the labor force. There won't be to replace these baby boomers who are now exiting the labor force. So we're simply entering an era with fewer young Americans being born right now in this country to replace people who are retiring in the labor force. I am a big fan of OECD data. I love looking at international comparisons. The lines are a little bit hard to see here, but so one thing to point out, the US is by far the largest population in this zoom in of countries. So we tend to weight that average, that OECD average. But I want to point out that the US is, below Canada. And why is that an important thing to highlight? Because Canada has a younger population, in part because they have had more assertive immigration policies for attracting workers. And a recent policy is explicitly trying to attract workers from the US who are having trouble with US immigration policy right now. So the US backlog is helping Canada. We talk a lot about Italy and France and Japan and their aging populations. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is that Italy actually has a younger population, or a sort of a larger share of working age population people than France right now. Some of the protests that we're seeing in France, right? This is very much about this, where aging and the labor force comes to a head. You have people who are used to claiming a pension at a certain age. The situation right now is there's not enough young workers, or the policies are such that you cannot keep supporting all of these older pensioners. So things have to change in France. It's creating social conflict right now. So the point to take from this slide is that what we're experiencing here in the US, many, many other countries are experiencing as well. The share of working age population is on the decline. I include this slide because one of the solutions you'll see in the news spoken about a lot is people will just live and work longer, and that's going to be a possible solution. Well, in fact, those working over the age of 65, it's a small share, right? It's a smaller share of the overall percent of the civilian labor force. And if you look at the projections that the BLS is doing to 2032, you'll see that yes, there's going to be more people over the age of 65 working, but it's not at a large magnitude. So the percentages increase, but it's not this huge wave of older people continuing to work. Most people will believe that they will work longer than they actually do. So it's another important factor to kind of consider in all of this. We're not going to make up ground in our labor force through older workers. Okay, so another thing to think about, and this is something that Walter referred to as well in his population, is that since 2010, death rates have risen for young and older workers in that sort of working age population. The trends are being driven by increases in drug overdoses, alcohol, suicide, diabetes, and obesity related health conditions. So it's the deaths of despair that Walter referred to, as well as these other sort of comorbidities. COVID-19 exacerbated this trend, 58 excess deaths per 100,000 people in 2020 alone for that working age population group. But the thing that we don't talk a lot about in this country is long COVID and how long COVID will have implications as well. We know that people have come out of the labor force because of long COVID symptoms. We don't really understand this fully right now, though, and or what the long-term implications of this are. Will those people eventually return to the labor force or not? Okay, so again, these cross-national comparisons are really helpful. This is from a PRB report that came out a couple of years ago that was called Dying Young. And it really shows US exceptionalism in a really tragic way. Shows that Americans have a higher likelihood of dying in every age group under 25 relative to similar peer countries. So I point this out not to be a downer, although it is kind of a downer, but because we like to think that young people will sort of make up this large share of the population. Again, if you have these deaths, then you lose those workers sort of over the long term of your labor force. Okay. Immigration, we come back to immigration. Immigration has stalled in the US. There are various efforts underway to change this. But as you know, there's a lot of political divide about this in Washington, D.C. right now. So between 2010 and 2018, immigrants and their U.S.-born children composed 28% of all U.S. workers and contributed to 83% of labor force growth. This is from the Migration Policy Institute. In recent years, these immigration backlogs have really created some challenges nationally. There's administrative delays. COVID really slowed everything down. It's picked up since COVID. And between 2021 and 2022, the Census Bureau reported that really, the million people that we added were really attributed to immigration. So it's not births that are contributing to our population sort of stability and or like slight uptick in population. It's really immigration. So consequently, this slowdown in immigration will have long-term impacts for our labor force, unless we can implement some dedicated policy changes that will address this. Again, Canada is happy to take all of our workers who can't come to this country and work. So just something to kind of keep in mind. So again, I come back to policy because I think policy really matters here. This is not simply about demographics. This is also about the deliberate policy changes that we're making in the US that states also can make as well, that employers can make. The US is truly notable. Again, we are exceptional for our lack of family-friendly policies in the US. This can really limit labor force participation on many fronts. The Minneapolis Fed did some great studies of who was most impacted by COVID, and many working mothers, disproportionately women of color, and mothers of very young children were the ones who had to immediately drop out of the labor force. When childcare closes, when school closes, who's generally caring for those kids? It's generally mothers. And we can talk more about that. That's a whole separate panel, but that's what happens. So flexibility is really important, and having some sort of dedicated childcare policy and or family-friendly policy is something that could change the tide in the U.S. in terms of women's labor force participation. Women's labor force participation in this country has been stagnant. And if we look, for example, to Canada, they have higher women's labor force participation as well. Employer policies matter as well. Ending remote work could change working parents' abilities to continue balancing work and family, right? We've seen a little bit of an uptick in recently in women's labor force participation, and remote work is one of the reasons why people can continue to engage. Similarly, people with disabilities, a chunk of the population who really want to work and be engaged in work, and for various reasons, it can be hard, whether that's lack of reasonable accommodations or employer biases. So remote work in the era of COVID actually created a little bit of an uptick in people with disabilities who are able to work and participate in the labor force. Hiring policies, those that exclude, for example, justice-involved people, further limit this pool. So all of this to say that we're not just grappling with demographic changes here, we're also grappling with some very deliberate policy choices that we've made in the US, both sort of across government policy changes, policy decisions, and employer policy decisions. So bold policy can be an answer. So I am now going to turn the mic over, I think, to Dowell.
Next up.
Dowell, I'm not going to introduce you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm so happy to be seated here on this panel. I get to actually show some data. I mean, I'm going to show you data. This is trying to address a question: if the tug of war between job growth and housing and population, how does that play out? This is a presentation. It's really based on exploratory work conducted by, well, the team. I'm leading the team, but the work is being directed by Sun Moon Cho. Sun Moon is in the back right there. And also Kevin Kane from SCAG is participating in this. And so we thank SCAG for research support in this project. We're borrowing from SCAG this three-part diagram, is a timeless question about what the right balance is among these three components. They're inescapable. And I think Elizabeth Garner referenced this kind of triad also in her remarks from Colorado. We have the data on this. I'm just going to show you all the data. So here it goes. Oh, no, I'm going to skip ahead. I don't want to show you that yet. I'm going to do it backwards. I want to change it. We're going to look at employment. I want to relook at the details. I want to show you the data. I want to show you the data. Here it is. We're going to go reams of data, millions of records just like this. And we have this for every household. We know who the householder is and what the relationship of everybody else to the householder. This one's married, has a spouse, has children. Here's their ages. And then here's their the employment status of all these individuals and their earnings. So I'm just going to show you those data. But the point being is you want to peel back the lid on employment in households. What is the density of workers? And how many of these households have no workers at all? How many have two workers, or how many have three or more? And I'll show you in a minute, the age is a crucial factor, as well as the type of the housing unit. And now I want to back up here to look at the big dilemma. The problem is this: we have this growth in employment in the SCAG region of 17% total growth in employment since the year 2006. That was the high point of the last big expansion before the recession. And we ended in 2019, which is right before the pandemic cut things off. 17% growth in employment, only 8% growth in housing. In the US, their employment growth was slower, 14%, and their housing growth was faster, 10%. So basically, we're out of balance here. And the SCAG job growth is outweighing housing by 100%. In the US, employment only outweighs housing by 38%. So you could say the SCAG imbalance is virtually triple the imbalance in the US. So this is not possible. Is it really possible? These workers have to live somewhere. So the real point of our presentation here is, where do they live? Whose household do they live in? Using these data right here, and I'll give you some results. This is a percentage of households with no workers. We call them empty worker households. And you see that it starts like 5% have no workers until after age 60 when it takes off. This is only relevant because, as Diana was just pointing out, we do have an aging population. We have a lot of baby boomers. They're all moving into this empty worker category. I'll maintain till my death, I probably will, that the older boomers have a right to retire, and they have a right to stay in their houses. So, okay, we'll come back to policy conclusions on that later, because you can't deny that right. On the right-hand side, we look at multiple worker households. It must take up the slack. If there's somebody with 0 workers, we have to have some with more than 1. Here's the 2 workers, and I'm comparing the US and SCAG. It's pretty close. And then there's this other category down here, the 3 or more workers, and it's way more common in the SCAG region than it is in the US. I don't know if anybody has any ideas of why there's this big hump here between ages 45 and 65, a big hump in 3 or more earner households. We'll explain that in a minute, I think. Here's a big picture of all those parts put together. Every age group adds up to 100%. Here's the breakdown. The empty workers are clearly visible. And at the top of the chart, you have the 3 or more worker category. The single earners are pretty common, like 40% of the total in middle age. But dual earners are equally common, or maybe more common in middle age. And then there's that hump, the 3 earner hump. It's generational. We think that the householders have gotten old enough that their children have also gotten old enough, and they have live-at-home kids who are working. Either they stayed there and got a job, or they boomerang back later and they're living with their parents. And it happens at that one age range, and after that, it doesn't. It dissipates. The importance of counting everybody is, I can't just say because somebody retires that no one's working. So this is looking at how many people are working in households that are headed by 85-year-old. And it shows you there's like 15% of those households have workers. And it may not be the older person themselves. It could be the kids or their younger spouse or whoever. We can look at it separately by housing type. And so of all the housing units, this is how they're divvied up. All the housing units in the region, and we see that a large share are taken by older people with empty workers, but most of it is got productive workers. But in the SCAG region, there's a lot with 3 earners, and that's how we're sort of shoehorning our workforce into a limited housing stock, it appears. It depends also on what type of housing is it. This next slide shows multifamily renters on one side, and multifamily is skewed towards younger adults. I boxed in this one age group just to focus, age 35, 39, and you see that there's mostly single earners there, but there are dual earners also present in a lot of those housing units. Those are, again, multifamily rentals, and in older ages, there's fewer of those. Conversely, on the right-hand side, we have the single-family owners that are skewed way towards older people because young people can't afford to get in there yet. And they also have multiple earners. Even at young ages, there's very few single earner homeowners. They're all depending on dual earners to get the mortgage to start with. But then they're also picking up extra earners along the way. And these can't be their children at these ages. So maybe that's their relative, their sister, their nephew, or it could be just a roommate that they brought in also. It's unclear. But clearly there's a lot of sharing of space going on in these housing units. And that's how we're answering the question, I think, of how can it be possible to have so few housing units be produced relative to so much job growth. Right now, we're really relying a lot on doubling up, and it's unequal. Surely it's unequal because there may be ethnic differences here, that Asians and Latinos are much more commonly living in multi-generational households. And so we haven't yet broken that out, but we will find that, I'm sure. But we also know that among white population, also there's already a lot of this also happening there increasingly. So it's I want to just highlight just the 3 or more worker category, just comparing SCAG in the US. You see how it's much more common in SCAG. And by housing type, the red line there is for single family owners. They have the highest propensity, both before and after age 60. The gray line to the left a little bit is single family rentals. They have a lot of 3-earner households because single family units have more space. It's easier to bring in extra people. And so they're living in those larger units and sharing the rent. The multifamily rentals, even there though, there's also well twice as many relative to the U.S. Apartment dwellers are having 3 or more earners. We're really pretty doubled up here in Southern California. So I think that's presentation. You get the idea, and live on.
All right, thanks, Dow. We'll now go to Max Buckles. Max is a postdoctoral candidate over at UCLA, and he's going to talk a little bit more close to home.
Yes. Cool. Yeah, so I'm a postdoc at UCLA, which basically just means I do research at UCLA, if you don't know. And today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between urbanization and racial and gender income inequality here in the US. So I have to do 2 quick acknowledgements. One is that my work is funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation, and any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations are mine and not those of the NSF. And likewise, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some analysis I'm doing with restricted Bureau of Labor Statistics data. And again, these are my views, not those of the BLS. Okay. So some kind of background that's going to help you kind of make sense of everything that I'm going to be talking about, all the results and everything. So I'm going to be talking about urbanization, density, size at the regional scale, not for cities. And there might be implications for cities, but I'm going to be talking about regions, right? These are metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs, here in Southern California. So you can see the LA one, for example, with the big orange dot is LA County and Orange County. This, by the way, is a map from my website. It's interactive, and so you can play around with all the data I'm going to be talking about today if you're curious. But yeah, so I'm talking about regions. The second thing is that I'm going to be talking about the US context, and that's one where we have a lot of racial and gender inequality to begin with. We're very stratified along these lines. And likewise, it's one where density isn't something that we do a great job of planning for. It mostly just kind of happens to places. And then there are consequences for labor markets, for housing markets, for transportation, right? So kind of what then happens as places are getting denser, right? Okay, so in urban economics and economic geography, kind of one of the best established relationships we have, and hopefully you could see this, the formatting looks a little strange to me, but that's all right, is a very strong positive relationship between the density or size of an urban region. I'm just going to call that urbanization, and workers' wage and salary incomes. So in denser, bigger regions, workers on average have higher wage and salary incomes, and this is called the urban wage premium. Now, recently, we've come to learn that there is actually a lot of kind of variation in the urban wage premium for different groups in the labor force. And so in particular, you could see the black line is for all workers. That's what we were just looking at on the last slide. But you can see kind of right above that at the beginning is a steeper slope for white workers, meaning that white workers have a stronger urban wage premium than workers overall. And likewise, right kind of next to them is men, who again have a stronger urban wage premium than most workers do overall. But then down towards the bottom, we can see, for example, Black and Latinx workers, which is people who identify as Hispanic on the census. We could see a very weak urban wage premium for them, right? So their wages are much kind of less strongly related to the density and the size of the city that they live in, or the urban region, I should say. And likewise for women, we can see that the slope is kind of less steep than it is for men. And so basically what the consequence of all this is that in bigger, denser cities, we have more wage and salary income inequality than in smaller, less dense cities.
because men and white people have this really strong urban wage premium that not all other groups have, which I'll just point out is it's actually stronger for men and white people than it is for college educated workers, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so this previous slide still kind of leaves open some questions that I'm asking in my work. So one is it just kind of a story about these groups having sort of different characteristics, different levels of education, different levels of work experience? Or is there really like a kind of race and gender sort of effect here? Now, what I want to point out is that even if after controlling for different kind of individual characteristics like education and experience, we didn't observe any kind of racialized or gender differences in the urban wage premium, that doesn't really negate that there is a race and gender effect, because race and gender are going to shape the extent to which you get work experience, to which you get education, right? But from a policy perspective, it's interesting to know. And then likewise, we want to know, well, is it just kind of an association between density and inequality, or sort of like what happens when we control for a bunch of other stuff at the city level? So like kind of urban areas like demographic or economic composition. And then likewise, if we wanted to get at kind of like a causal interpretation of the relationship between density and inequality, we would ideally look at how changes in density within urban regions are related to changes in inequality. So I'm doing all this in my work. I'm controlling for all this individual stuff, this city level stuff, and I'm looking at how changes in density are related to changes in inequality. I have a paper that's coming out probably next week. It'll be published online in the Journal of Urban Affairs. So if you want to see kind of more details on everything I'm about to talk about, you can email me and I'll make sure you get a copy. So my main finding in the paper is that 100-person per square mile increase in population density is associated with 32.9, 46.1, and 27.5 cent increases in hourly Black, white, Latinx, white, and female male wage inequality. Now you might be asking, what is 100 people per square mile? That's pretty abstract, right? So to give you a little bit of a sense here, for kind of the big MSAs in Southern California, between 2000 and 2018, which is my study period, the LA metropolitan area increased by about 185 people per square mile, San Diego by about 116, and then Oxnard in the Inland Empire by about 52 and 46. Now, even with this, you still may be asking, well, again, these hourly numbers don't really mean much to me. How do I make sense of this? So I've produced some point estimates, which are just like estimates of how much inequality increased for annual wage inequality in San Diego. And San Diego is an interesting case because it's the one where what actually happened in the data most closely fits what my model would predict of all the MSAs in the country. And likewise, it's a place that increased a lot in density over the study period, but it's not even in the top 20. So it's high, but not that high. And in San Diego, kind of what my model implies is sort of annual increases in wage inequality just because of the changes in density that happened within the city, between about $600 and $1,000 between these different groups. Okay. So at this point, you might be asking, well, what is it exactly about density that would cause inequality to increase? So I'm looking at two different things in my work. So I think you might be thinking on the one hand, like density could make it easier for people to move around. It could make it easier for people to get to work, to take their kids to school, to go grocery shopping, to do all the things that they have to do throughout the week, right? But of course, this is America, and that is just not the case here, in large part, I think, because of how we do density. But in general, in the US, what we observe is that in denser cities, workers spend more time traveling between activities. And this is because density can also create congestion, right? And this kind of opens up this question then, well, who is kind of bearing the brunt of these congestion costs, right? And there's different sort of clues in the literature, and what I argue in this paper is that women and people of color are likely to bear the brunt of these congestion costs of density. So I test for this in the paper, and sort of my finding is that density is much more strongly associated with inequality when congestion also increases, which I'm measuring by commute times. So when commute times go up, density has a much more strong relationship with inequality. And sort of the implication there then is that women, Black, and Latinx workers are indeed bearing the brunt of these costs, these congestion costs of density. So in another paper, and this is the restricted BLS data, and this is more preliminary, we're kind of looking at, so I haven't exactly talked about why there is this urban wage premium to begin with, right? And one of the explanations that's gotten a lot of traction recently, in large part because of a really great paper done by someone at USC, is that the urban wage premium is in large part about dynamic benefits. And what that means is just that workers are able to accumulate more valuable skills and experience in larger cities. So big city work experience is worth more in the labor market than small city work experience. And so we test this with data on individual workers who we can follow over their entire careers. And we follow them as they move in and out of big and small cities. And essentially what we find in that paper is that big city work experience is worth about half to a quarter as much for Black workers and Latinx workers as it is for white workers. And so what this suggests is that part of this disparity in the urban wage premium is about this kind of idea that Black and Latinx workers aren't getting the same return to building their careers in big cities that white workers get. Okay, so I'm going to end on my policy caveat that I always give when I talk about this work, which is that I am not trying to make a case against increasing density in US cities. That is very much something that we need to do. But what I'm trying to remind folks of is that density is not inherently inclusive. Density has costs in the form of congestion, and we need to ask ourselves who is going to bear those costs. And what my work points to and what work by other folks points to is that it's mostly women and people of color. And then in terms of like what we can actually do in terms of policy, I don't have the answer for you. And I think we need more work, more research to really like kind of ask that question more specifically. But things that make sense to me based on my read of the literature are things like more racial integration in transit-rich areas, improving mobility throughout urban regions, investing in transportation infrastructure, and then likewise bringing jobs into Black and Latinx communities that have really been deprived of them for many decades, and likewise into suburban areas where women, and especially women with kids, are able to access them as well. So that is it for me. And yeah, thanks.
Wow. Okay. Thanks, Max and Diane and Dowell. Great presentations. I want to go back to Diana before we take questions. I appreciate your comparative analysis using international data because that allows us to put things in the right context. And when we think about what we're dealing with increased mortality, flat migration, low birth rates, it's like a perfect storm with regards to labor force participation. And I just wondered if there is any some specific policy levers. I know you identified some of those things in terms of how we bring women into the workforce. Are there some, can you expand on some of those policy levers that we can actually move or use to engage more participation in labor force? Because we're not getting a whole lot of people available anymore as we used to have, but the ones that are available, we want to make sure we get a maximum participation from them. How do we do that?
Yeah, so I'm going to start this off by saying I'm not going to advocate for policy.
All right.
The stock line, but again, I think there are interesting examples. Again, internationally, even within the U.S., that you could point to where people have tried, new policy fixes. So there are, for example, solutions like pre-K programs and universal sort of 3 and 4 pre-K programs, which are sort of a possible lever that people could pull. And I know that you're all going to be implementing some changes on that front real soon. I'll go back to Canada, but Canada has a really great example that, started in Quebec, and it, again, it allows more people to, if there's high quality care for their kids, it allows more people to enter the labor force and participate. Now, there are larger policy levers that could be pulled. I'm not sure that our country is ready to really sort of roll up our sleeves and make those fixes. But there are great examples of how we could, again, drawing from international perspectives, there's certain temporary work visas that could be enacted that are being enacted in different countries, and ways to kind of create these fixes that might create a more sort of immediate solution.
Thank you. Dowell, I have to agree with you. Seniors have a right to age in place. So let's just stipulate to that before we move forward. So that's not in debate. Seniors have a right to age in place. Now, that has been an issue for us, especially in our region. As seniors age in place, there isn't that natural turnover of homes for the first-time home buyers. We've talked about that ad nauseum over the last few years. I'm intrigued by the extra bedrooms that you are sort of pointing to. I think you've done a study on the extra bedrooms that are available in various regions, and I think your study shows we have the fewest here in our region. Is that right? Because I think to some extent, what's that suggesting? And this is me just maybe making stuff up now. It sounds like what you're suggesting is maybe you're not suggesting, but what it sounds to me like is, we have this push to build more homes because we do need more homes. But it sounds like we're also saying there might actually be available rooms for accommodation for people that are in the labor force in the region already. Am I getting that wrong?
Well, let me give a compact response, policy response. First, I'll say that on right to stay in age in place, yes, but in that case, we need to actually have those same people vote for a lot more housing, since they're going to be keeping theirs. And so we need more housing. Now, the extra bedrooms you're referring to, that's a study from last year. I think it may have been presented here, and those are like unused bedrooms that there's not enough people to fill them all, and we have more of our bedrooms are filled. My policy complaint is the most basic one. All the rentals that are built, like 90%, are 1 and 2 bedroom. And the other 10% are studios. And so low-income families shoehorn into those overly small apartments. Why don't we have more 3 bedrooms? Why don't we have policy incentives to, make the bedrooms small, 8 feet by 12 feet. And why do we need them also for work from home? It's not just for the added people, but also work from home. We're not building multifamily units to really accommodate the real world. And apparently we're overstuffed in this region. We should have more 3 bedrooms to start with, and maybe even 4 bedrooms. The extra bedroom idea, though, is also that some people are hoarding space. They have like a bedroom for them, an extra bedroom for their den, and then 2 more bedrooms empty. And there's not really a way to leverage that and get that back. ADUs, not ADUs, Airbnb originally was going to be people renting out extra rooms. Well, now they want to rent out whole extra apartments, which is damaging to the housing stock because it takes the apartments out of the residential year-round use and puts them into a hotel occupancy use. So I'm pretty opposed to that. Renting out rooms, fine. We should definitely encourage that part of Airbnb. So these are a number of different things you could do, but all these are kind of intrusive into people's private property and how they use it. So the simplest solution is just build a lot more housing, and then everybody can have their own property and treat it more like the way they want. But it would be nice if we had more apartments with 2, 3, and 4 bedrooms.
Thanks. I'm glad you clarify that. So we still need more housing build, period. But we could also optimize what's available in our region. I want to come to Max, and I don't know if there are any questions. Are there any questions in the audience on this? I don't see any questions. Okay. Any online? Okay, after this. So Max, I am very intrigued by your summation about density, because we've, you know, in our environment of trying to be sustainable, we want to make sure we maximize the built environment, and of course density comes to mind, and there are both sides of density where people think it's bad and other things it's good. I think it's interesting that density has this wage premium that you talked about. I had never really settled on that, and that's an important point. But you also talk about the fact that density creates inequities, and so you were beginning to get to some of the mitigation, and I just want you to tease that out a little bit more, because you're not suggesting density is bad because of the inequities. You're just saying density hasn't been done right, right?
Yeah, so I'm saying density is not inherently good, and I think in large part it's about the way that we do density here in the U.S. I mean, what I would like to do is like some comparative work on other countries where you know density looks totally different. But I think, you know, and again, like I'm speculating here, but like if we put up a bunch of luxury condos somewhere, I'm not sure that's going to be good for equity. You know what I mean? And that's often what density looks like in the US, what denser places look like. So, and again, the processes I'm talking about operate at the regional scale. So there's questions of like of gentrification, of suburbanization of poverty, these kinds of things. Like as places are getting denser, how are people sorting within places, and how's that all changing? So I think to get at like any kind of a policy thing, yeah, we would need more research. But I think, you know, what I'm trying to expose people to for now, at least, is that denser places are more unequal, and that density, yeah, is not inherently good.
Are there examples internationally of things that are done differently with regards to density?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look like in, you know, some European countries, for example, like in the UK or France, I think what a dense city looks like is really different than it is in the US. I mean, here, another thing about like bigger, denser cities is they're some of the most segregated places in the country, right? So, I mean, again, I think I'd need to do more research on this, but yeah.
All right. I'm looking at the clock here. Are there any questions online?
I can roll in one. There are a couple of questions online that are a little bit more Diana directed, but probably to the group more broadly. When thinking about kind of cutting carbon emissions and global environmental impact, you know, is there any, you know, isn't the kind of the demographic shift that we're seeing, which has these labor force implications, you know, can that kind of be treated as a positive to a degree, especially considering the prevalence of more workplace automation, AI, and everything like that? There's also a question, I'll leave it because it's a little bit similar, about kind of telework and telework policy for labor force implications.
And we can start with Diana and see if the others have comments.
Sure. On the telework and labor force participation piece, I think it's important to remember who has access to work from home. And again, if we're going to talk about inequality, there's a lot of inequality baked into that. Certainly in hospitality, that's not necessarily something where you can work from home, and who tends to be represented more often in hospitality, right? It's women, people of color. So again, I think I just wanted to sort of make that caveat that work from home is not universal. Work from home does, however, allow more people to have access to more balance. Again, I think the statistics with people with disabilities, ticking up their labor force participation, I mean, that was a surprising finding to me during COVID, that people with disabilities ticked up their labor force participation. So it does speak to something about telework and work from home policies that makes it more manageable for people who otherwise don't have the same opportunities in the labor force they would without it.
Max?
I no comment on that specific question, yeah.
No. Any other comments? Any other questions? Mary?
Just wanted to make one comment about the Airbnb Airbnb is working on being able to turn entire apartment complexes or multifamily buildings into Airbnb buildings. So that's something that seems to be coming down the pipeline. I don't know if they have the legal, they're working on the legal aspects of it, but the other is, are we all pointing to, or can we point to the need for some kind of, we used to, my immigrant grandfather used to call it more centralized planning, because it's one thing to have policy on local levels, but like SCAG attempts to do, don't we need a larger, maybe national or much larger regional types of planning to occur on all of these issues?
I'll just say yes. We're notoriously bad at regional planning here in the US, and we need more regional planning. Yeah.
Well, it also speaks to, and I wonder if maybe we've sort of touched on it. Maybe there's and again, I'm sort of going off of what you laid out, Max. We need to start rethinking, not just in terms of spatial, placing of people, but also the design of our lived environments, such that it's taken into consideration what our living experiences are going to be like, and what our work experience are going to be like, and where both of those things come together anymore, since we've learned that very well during COVID. Do you have any expressions of what we should be looking to see? Again, this is all speculation, so there are no questions. So let's have free form here on speculation. What do you foresee in terms of how we optimize our living environments with trying to bring work and housing together?
I'll say a big question for me is whether work from home policies are going to stay constant, if they're going to tick down, if they're going to tick up. And I think that will be a very important factor to think about in terms of this work and housing nexus over the coming years. I don't think we have all the answers yet. And you're seeing employers starting to enforce policies and workers actively rejecting them, right? But again, these are these are workers who have more advantages in the workforce. So that will be a really interesting thing, I think, to watch over the next decade.
Well, economics does count, and the shortage of workers gives the workers a lot more leverage. They can really call the shots more than they could before. And we're seeing that with the return to the office after the pandemic. Well, there's a lot of holdouts, and the employers are unable to, command them because there's not enough workers. So this is an interesting moment right now. We're seeing it not just in high-tech workers, but even in Hollywood workers. It's a shortage of workers. It underlies all this. It's a good thing, but at some point it's a bad thing. I'm interested most in the problems with daycare workers, because if it's a shortage of workers, how are you going to get daycare workers? That's an exhausting job. Well, you need the daycare workers to liberate the family workers who can do the other jobs. So it's a bottleneck. So I don't know. I think immigrants are a good solution. They'll take those jobs. And people have actually challenged me before on a question like that. Well, so isn't that inequality bringing immigrants to do low-level jobs? And I say, well, the immigrant parents are fine with those jobs, but their kids are not. And so as long as we are promoting their kids into middle-class workforce, then it's fine to import workers who are immigrants to do the low-level jobs. That's my compromise position. We need all kinds of workers at all levels. Just let's take turns doing the hard jobs. Would be the fairest way to go.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I will, but I think we might be out of time.
So I guess we're out of time. I was beginning to enjoy that more than I should. Again, I want to thank the panel. I think one of the things you hopefully take away from this is there is a lot of information, data with regards to what we look like. This is the gem of this conference is there's data showing the trends that we expect to see. What we hope to hopefully do is turn that data into some intelligence to help inform policies that allow us to meet the future that's in front of us. Again, thank you, and help me thank the panel.